Talking of, you are a great advocate of emotional governments as a sort sub-discipline, if we can call it as such, of strategic communication. I'm wondering, can you give us a good and a bad example of what that might be looking like?
So I think one of the best practices in terms of emotional governance. So when we talk about emotional governance, it's mostly related also to governments and policymakers. So how do they integrate emotions in their strategic communications? So it's really about taking stock of the emotions in the public, understanding what are the collective emotions, what are the intensity of those emotions, what is the combination of those emotions, what is the order in terms of the emotion, what is the flow, and then how can we integrate that in our response. And I think one of the best case studies or best practices that I can really think of is the response of the New Zealand government when dealing with the Christchurch attack. It's an example that I like to quote very often, because I think to this day it's probably one of the best so far in terms of crisis communication and how to integrate emotion in the communication. So you can really see how when you're looking at, when the Christchurch attacks, there would have had a lot of different implications in terms of how a government can respond. And when you have a crisis, people turn to a government because they need to make, sense of what is happening. So that's where that notion of reputational building, that notion of, trying to provide a meaning to what is happening to the collectivity, to society, becomes really important. But at the same time, we know that hostile actors, whether they're extremist groups or even disinformation actors, are trying to undermine our democracies, undermine social cohesion. So when you have an attack like Christchurch, for instance, the risk that are associated around that, and the risk of backlash around that particular attack is quite significant. And so as a government, you know, there's a need to try to provide that meeting while at the same time mitigating those negative impacts. And emotion, when we have a terrorist attack, emotions are very high. And ignoring public emotions would be, in my sense, a mistake. But that was handled very, very extremely well by the New Zealand government in terms of acknowledging what those emotions in the public were and trying to craft, their response, the strategic communications response around similar emotions, but emotions that strengthen social cohesion, emotions that bring people together. So it was really focused on that notion of togetherness. So having messages of empathy, of love, acknowledging the fear and the anxiety, but however, combining that with different types of emotions that really, at the end of the day, brought people together rather than dividing people. And I think that's one of the greatest success. So understanding what kind of emotions are out there in the public, the risk that are associated to these types of emotions, and then how can we actually integrate those emotions and manage those emotions in a way that kind of brings people together, mitigate the impact of a crisis. And I think very clearly, I remember when I was at the UN Congress for the victims of terrorism a couple of years ago, I think the representative from the New Zealand government made in its opening statement, she talked about the victims, but in the language that was used, it was not, the term victims was not used. It was a term, she used the term shaheed, which means martyr. And I'm not quite sure that a lot of people actually understood the progressiveness of that statement, because what it did is that it acknowledged the emotions and the narratives of the community affected themselves by the violence. And by doing that, it was, integrated in a public policy statement, And at the same time, it kind of reclaimed that term that is being hijacked by different extremist groups and organizations for recruitment, as we know. So it's very, very powerful when you have a government who, through the language, also acknowledges that emotions of a community that has been affected by violence. So there's a lot more that can be said, but I do think that because of the response of the government in relation to the Christchurch attacks in New Zealand, you could really see also that kind of notion of empathy, compassion, togetherness didn't just stay within the borders of New Zealand, but really really shine through some of the Middle East, where there was really also expression of solidarity and compassion to what happened. So it was very powerful in terms of bringing people together and strengthening social cohesion.
In a certain way, she made that statement also as an instrument of foreign policy.
Yes, of course. I think it's important to when we talk about strategic communications, there are so many different layers to consider, because the message, whatever the content of the message is, it has influence, it has power, it has very deep implications. You were asking me about a bad example. And one of the examples that I usually quote is how, what the response was from the Bush administration when 9/11 happened. Very much of the response, and, we can understand why the response was what it was, but I'm not entirely sure that it was well thought through, because, 2 decades later, we're still feeling the vibrations or the reverberations of that particular statement that then became into a policy. But it was very much in the aftermath, a communication that was framed in the language of war. So it was not about bringing people together. It was a very divisive kind of statement. So you could really feel the anger, the fear, and at the same time, it gave a lot of visibility and oxygen to the terrorist organization, which is precisely what they want. And I think the lesson learned from that is that when you look at Christchurch, we had none of that, because it was very clear when she said, we're not going to even mention the name of the perpetrator. So it was cutting off that kind of oxygen. So if we look at 9/11, you can see that kind of the toxicity that resulted from that, crisis communication is now that we have more polarization and more stigmatization of certain religious communities as a result of that. And it's also altering the way that certain young individuals who were not even, born when 9/11 happened are still being affected by that particular narrative that was really coached in a language of war and with high emotions of anger and fear. And in the end, it united people and it divided people through fear and anger, which you don't have when you look at the strategic communication of the government of New Zealand in relation to Christchurch, because it was more about not dividing people and bringing people together. So emotions are very powerful. It's I think important to understand the drivers, the emotional drivers, the kind of emotions, and also what are the combination of emotions and the types of responses or behavior responses are we wanting, or changes we're wanting when we are integrating emotions in strategic communication. And that's true about the prevention and countering of violent extremism. It's true if you talk about migration. It's true if you look at climate change. We also have to consider integrating that emotional dimension in strategic communication within those fields.